Okay, guys, we are back outside again for a little more reading. Picking up on chapter 11. We darted through the house as Jasper's barks echoed behind us. At the back door, I took a deep breath and motioned for Lucas to be quiet, then unlocked it and stepped into the night. The wind had picked up, battering us as we crept across the lawn. Each crunch of grass echoed in my ankle as I negotiated the roots and twigs, praying I didn't trip over any of them and give us away. Why were the police at my house? Either Dr. Mito was worried that I hadn't answered my phone, or someone had seen Lucas in the neighborhood. I felt the weight of 1,000 neighbors' stares on our backs. Charges raced through my head: aiding and abetting, accessory, repeat offender. The last one found its mark and sent a shot of adrenaline through my system, bracing me, numbing me better than any drug as I had acknowledged the full implications of what I was doing. Behind us, a flashlight beam arced across the neighbor's lawn. They'd be turning the corner any second. We ducked into the shadows of the garage and raced to the side door. There were no windows in here. We could wait out the cops and decide what to do next. With shaking fingers, I eased the creaky knob open and pushed against the wood. Lucas was a millisecond behind me as we rushed inside. Then, both of us staggered to a halt. Dad stood next to his truck holding a tire iron. His arm relaxed when he saw me, but he stared at Lucas, obviously trying to figure out what was going on. Dad, I checked behind us to see the lawn was still empty. This is. A few different lies zipped through my head, none of them really plausible, with Lucas standing there in the hospital scrubs and one arm bound in a sling. Before I could pick one, he cleared his throat and finished the sentence for me. Lucas Blackthorne. Lucas glanced at me, apparently as unsure as I was about how to proceed. Your picture's been all over the news tonight. The surprise on Dad's face melted into suspicion, and even though he kept his eyes on Lucas, I knew the next question was for me. What the hell's going on here? Dad? Sir? We spoke at the same time, both of us stepping forward right as a policeman walked through the main garage door. He surveyed the scene and homed in on Lucas, easily identifying him in the light from the workbench. Without acknowledging any of us, he pulled his gun and radioed his coordinates in, asking for backup. It was over. With a sinking feeling, I turned my back on everyone else and touched Lucas's coat. Don't put up a fight. If you have to go to jail, I'll try to get them to release you as soon as possible. Just ignore everyone like you always do. His arm was rigid, almost bursting with tension. But he dropped his voice, gaze frozen on the officer, my father. It's okay, I patted the sling, trying to reassure him, to sound like I had the power to make any of this okay. Be mute, I'll handle the rest. Dad stood off to the side, obviously listening to our exchange. I lifted my chin, determined not to be ashamed of the choices I'd made tonight. Our gazes met for a split second, and then, just as the officer finished his radio call, Dad turned around and set the tire iron on a shelf. Glad you stopped by, he said conversationally. My name's Brian Stark. Look who I found wandering around on the docks. Sir, this young man is considered a dangerous individual. I'd advise you to back away. You too, miss. Shit. Him? More like a lost puppy. Come here, boy. Lucas, isn't it? Although digesting the turn of events, Lucas seemed rooted to his spot. I leaned into him, nudging him forward. Shoulders still tight, his free hand fisted, he took a calculated step toward my dad. He swallowed before speaking. Yes, sir? You feel like hurting any of us? Of course not. His face, though, said the exact opposite. See, Dad gave Lucas what appeared to be a pat on the shoulder, but I knew that move from the days when I'd run loose on the streets, unwilling to listen to a thing he said. Dad was anchoring him in place. I brought him here to see what Maya wanted to do with him. Sir, you should have brought him immediately to the station. The officer still had his gun trained on his suspect. I spoke up. I work with Lucas at Congdon. The officer's expression made it clear he didn't think I looked capable of much more than graffiti, let alone having a career. My order said the suspect's doctor lived here. She's a speech therapist working for Dr. Ria Mekta, Dad said. Great woman. Anyway, we finished detailing the boat, and I was headed back to my truck when I spotted this one dangling off the pier, Northland Pier. I'd seen the news, of course, so I went over and told him I was Maya's dad, and he came along with me. We were just fixing to take him back. Right, Lucas? I saw my dad's grip tighten on Lucas's shoulder, and there was a beat before Lucas nodded and his left hand uncurled at his side. I'm sorry if I caused anyone any trouble. I wanted to see Superior. I kept hearing about it and wanted to see the water for myself. Jesus Christ, the officer grumbled, relaxing his stance. He waved the gun at the truck. Go over there and put your hands on the hood. I have to pat you down anyway. Lucas glanced at me, and I nodded. So he stiffly walked to the truck and submitted to the inspection. Two more squad cars showed up within a few minutes, their lights flashing all over the alley. The neighbors, I'd imagined, watching us before, were now glued to their windows, and I saw at least one phone pointed at us from behind some curtains. I hobbled back to the house, where Jasper was losing his mind, and sent Dr. Mita a text to let her know the situation. After an extensive argument and 2 calls to superiors, I convinced the officers we should take Lucas directly back to Congdon according to our original plan. The hospital obviously didn't employ enough security to contain him. The courts had already placed him in our care, and no additional crime had been committed. Eventually, they agreed, and even allowed Dad and me to drive him, with a police escort. Lucas and I climbed into the back of Dad's truck, and we followed the police motorcade out of the alley. Dad punched the radio off, gripping the steering wheel in silence. Lucas stared out the window at the dark houses and wind-buffeted trees. The empty storefronts lined with Lincoln Park's night dwellers, dealers and drunks, peppered in with the blue-collared crowd out draining their paychecks as we drove toward downtown. Thanks, Dad. What happened to your foot? He took a turn too sharp, making Lucas lean into me and me brace against the door. Why aren't you still on the water? I countered. There's a storm coming in. But the Bannock burn. The Bannock burn's been out there for 100 years. It can wait a little longer. Your foot, Maya. I sighed. When he'd texted about the video and news coverage this morning, I'd admitted the part about spraining an ankle, assuming he wouldn't be back until long after it healed. I should have known better. Briefly, I recounted the taser incident and the hospital's treatment. The x-ray showed no breaks. It's fine. I can barely feel it. You don't limp when you're fine, he snapped, and we both fell in silence, hitting a stalemate. As we began climbing the hill, Lucas turned away from the window, glancing between me and the back of Dad's head. Duluth wasn't a big city, and the amount of time we had left in this side was already dwindling. Police lights blinked over his skin, forcing my mind up the hill to what lay ahead. You'll go to medical first, I spoke low, ignoring the angry slice of Dad's face in the rearview mirror. Hopefully you'll be back in Ward 2 in a few days, tops. He could hear what I wasn't saying. Swallowing, he looked at the tail of the squad car in front of us, and the city rushing past. He didn't respond. You can't just skip up to the Boundary Waters tonight. You're still weak. It's below freezing, and you don't have any gear. Winter's coming, he rounded on me. What would you do if it was your father out there? A bark of a laugh snapped both of our heads to the front of the cab. She prefers me gone. There's no one to complain when she half kills herself getting electrocuted or strangled by violent patients. Dad? I tried to jump in, but he only got louder. A captain used to bellowing over the wind. Lucas looked shell-shocked when he heard the last part, and I reached out to him quickly, shaking my head. Dad hadn't known Lucas was the patient who choked me, and it was in everyone's best interest to keep it that way. What the hell was going on back there, Maya? She didn't do anything, Lucas said. I came to find her. I didn't ask you, Blackthorn. The street lights broke in waves over Dad's face, splintering his irritation as he took another turn. And I thought you were supposed to be a kid. Lucas turned to me. I'm supposed to be a kid. You're 19, I told him, even though you don't look or act like a typical teenager. Lucas thought about that for a second. What are 19-year-olds supposed to act like? I shrugged. Younger, stupider. He smiled. I'll work on that. So how old are you? 23. And you're acting like a 13-year-old, Dad cut in, not ready to let the conversation get away from him. What happened back at the house? Lucas is my patient. He came to tell me some things we've been working on in therapy. I think we made a breakthrough tonight. Dad laughed again, and it was a hard sound. You got the lines down, Maya, but don't try to sell bullshit to me, even if you've made it smell like roses. Why were you running away from the police with him? I didn't answer. I couldn't even explain it to myself. Christ, I knew it was a bad idea when you took the job there. You don't go work at the same mental hospital where you spent time as a patient 7 years ago. Lucas looked at me sharply. His shock was palpable as I stared down at my lap and said in a voice that didn't sound like my own, 8 years ago. Whatever. The point is that you should be in the regular world with a normal job. Define normal. Out here, he flapped a hand at the dark, vacant streets. You could be a therapist in a clinic making twice the money and not getting attacked every day. Do you even know how much you're worth? It didn't go so well when I was out there in the regular world. Besides, I do good work at Condon. I help people. My voice came rushing back, and with it, my own anger. You're susceptible to this head case stuff. That's all I'm saying. It's not contagious, Dad. Lucas laughed once, but I could still sense his surprise. And I'm probably the least suspectable 23-year-old I've ever met. It comes from being half you. But you're half her, too. Before I could reply, Dad turned onto Condon Street, and I gasped. A reporter stood in front of the gate, filming a segment, next to at least a dozen people crowded onto the cracked sidewalk. They held signs and leaned into the shot, their faces washed bloodless by the camera light. There had only been a handful of them here when I punched out a few hours ago, but news of the escape must have made them multiply. A girl about Lucas's age, with bright red hair, stared at the truck as we approached, holding a piece of tagboard that read, "If he's crazy, I'm crazy." She pointed and yelled something, causing the rest of them to turn as one while the cameraman scrambled to get footage of our procession. Get down. I pushed Lucas by the good shoulder, doubling him over in the rear seat as the guards began herding people back, trying to make way for the police motorcade. The crowd didn't want to disperse. Who? Lucas began, but anything else he might have said was lost in the yells and clamor of a mass of bodies breaking free from the guards and racing towards us. Signs waved frantically. Hands reached out with grasping fingers as I held Lucas's head beneath the window. One of the police cruisers spun a U-turn inside the gate and flipped their siren on, driving between us and the crowd. As soon as the path forward was clear, Dad gunned the engine and sped through the parking lot to the main entrance, where a team of orderlies, nurses, and more security guards waited for us. I gave Dad's shoulder a squeeze before grabbing Lucas's hand and sliding across the seat to the door. Thanks, Dad. Don't wait for me. We hurried through the main doors, flanked by the remaining police officers. Once inside, we were rushed to the medical ward where they performed a series of checks on an uncharacteristically docile Lucas. He submitted to every probe, answered every question, and it wasn't until I saw Dr. Mita standing at the doorway to the triage area, eyes narrowed in speculation, that I realized I barely let go of Lucas's hand since the moment we got out of the truck. Chapter 12. The next morning, the world was coated in white. A thick frost had frozen every rooftop, lawn, and tree branch in Duluth as I peered out the staff break room, rubbing the couch debris out of my sleep-bruised eyes. A powdery snow whipped into the panes and skidded along the ground, as if the wind refused to let it land. Sometime in the night, I'd left Lucas in the care of the nurses and headed down the hall for a few restless hours of sleep. The break room furniture was scratchy and reeked of antiseptic, but it beat going home and trying to explain what happened last night while Dad looked at me in that way of his, like I was a vase glued carefully back together, and he had to constantly check me for missing pieces, fissures, any sign that I might crumble again. Today was my day off, though, and I couldn't leave Jasper alone much longer. I stared into the blowing white world and listened to the tick, tick, ticks of the snow against the window, each flake hurling winter that much closer. After checking on Lucas, who may or may not have been sleeping, I took the bus home and made sure the garage was empty before going in to shower and walk the dog. We drove up to Bayfront and paced the lake walk. where Jasper chased snow devils and I limped along the empty boards and scanned Superior's horizon. The powder wouldn't last. The sun would chase it away as soon as the clouds broke. But we were getting closer to November, and not even Superior's gales could fight off the uninvitable. Normally, I liked winter, the 4-foot drifts, the nostril-freezing Arctic blast that drove all the tourists away, leaving the town to the hardy, the survivors who bundled up and shoveled oceans of snow before retreating to our mugs and fleece blankets to wait out the endless December nights. Winter in Duluth was antisocial paradise, and for someone whose mother suffered from chronic depression, there was a disconcerting comfort in the isolation. A home I recognized, even if I hadn't asked for it. Today, though, I wasn't comforted by the cold blast of wind numbing my ankle. I didn't find relief in the absence of people on the late walk. Today, I was scared for a man I'd never met. After dropping Jasper off at home, I drove to the library and spent the rest of the morning poring over books and topographical maps. I studied pictures, read travelogues, and stared at the mottled landscape of greens and blues that would be covered in white, frozen over and close off to even the most adventurous hikers in a few short weeks. Maybe to a young boy it would look like a mountain of salt, vast and impenetrable. But Josiah Blackthorne was out there somewhere, sick, alone. I circled the location of the outfitter's store and drew ranges out from the center point. 5 miles, 10. How far would you go up the mountain to save the person you loved the most in the world? How far would I go to help them? 2 days after Lucas's hospital escape, I drove through the swelling crowd at Congdon's Gate. At least 15 people were bundled up and waving signs at passing cars, and punched in to find most of the staff either staring or whispering to each other on the opposite side of whatever room I was in. My dramatic recovery of the boy who came back from the dead, which had aired on every major news channel in Duluth, apparently sealed my reputation as something entirely apart from them. I spent the morning catching up on email, planning session activities for my other patients, and trying to ignore everyone whose Minnesotan niceness made them smile before walking hastily away. The one person I could count on for direct address, unfortunately, was the one person I was trying to avoid. Dr. Mita held me back after our afternoon staff meeting. I approved Lucas's transfer back to Ward 2 today. That's great, thanks. The group environment is his biggest challenge. The sooner we get him comfortable there, the quicker his recovery. I inched my way toward the door, thankful that my ankle felt almost back to normal. Yes, he still needs to acclimate and, of course, integrate his childhood experiences with the larger world. But Mr. Blackthorne strikes me as someone who needs a path forward. He should be thinking about short and medium-term goals. We'll start working on that right away. Obediently, I made a note of it, turning to leave. I haven't decided who his speech therapist will be yet. What? Halting in mid-escape, I swung on Dr. Mita. I'm his therapist. Shut the door and sit down, please, Maya. I complied, watching her wearily as she sat opposite me and carefully picked cat fur off her pants. You haven't told me what happened the night of Lucas's escape. In a clear, even voice, I told her the same story Dad had given to the police. Unlike the officers, though, Dr. Mita didn't appear the tiniest bit convinced. You weren't answering my calls earlier that evening. I'm sorry. I was tired and off duty. Dr. Mita nodded and let her gaze slide somewhere closer to my heart. A perfectly reasonable explanation, and if it was any of my other staff, quite in character. My tongue pressed against my palate and held. After a minute, she sighed and clasped her hands. And then we have Mr. Blackthorne. He left the hospital almost 2 hours before your father discovered him, claiming he was standing in plain sight in the middle of one of the busiest docks in Duluth. That's where Dad found him. I met her gaze head on, mixing mine with the right amounts of irritation and confusion. It still seems like a long gap of time to me. Did you ask him where he went? I countered. We did. He said he was wandering. Dr. Mita stared at me with her all-knowing look. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I barely made myself nod and murmur an acknowledgement. Lucas Blackthorne doesn't strike me as the wandering type. I took a deep breath. So I'll try to figure out what his goal was during our next sessions. I haven't worked this hard to earn his trust for nothing. Yes, I have no doubt that you've gained it. He's been asking for you, extremely politely, I'm told, with every new nurse at every shift change. He even struck up a conversation with one of the janitors about you, your interests, your background. Hector wasn't extremely helpful in the situation, apparently only knowing you as that little punk girl with the shit in her ear. See? I ignored the sudden upbeat in my pulse. So why would you make him start all over again with someone new? Because I'm worried about your attachment to each other. Jesus, she didn't pull any punches. I felt myself flushing, which might as well have been a big fat confirmation of our attachment. Dropping my gaze, I tried to find words that were both true and harmless. I like him. Obviously. You spent hours at his bedside in the hospital, off the clock, and when you brought him back here, you barely moved from his side all night. The medical team noticed what they called an unspoken communication between you. Well, for one, that sounds like gossipy bullshit. Dr. Mita chuckled. And two, I sighed and tossed my hands in the air. You're right. I have become attached to him. He reminds me of me, I guess. But is that so bad? I mean, don't you ever become fond of any of your patients? What about Big George? That man is a human-sized teddy bear. How can you not love him? Don't shift the topic. There's a difference between professional compassion and personal attachment. I made myself laugh. I'm not going to ask him to go steady, okay? It's against policy, it's dangerous, and to be completely honest, I'm more worried about the consequences for you than Mr. Blackthorne. This is insane. I launched myself out of the chair and paced behind it. In the 8 years I've known you, all you've ever told me is that I need to let myself connect with people, to open up to love and loss again and all that crap. Then you forced me to work with Lucas against my will and outside my professional scope. And now you've become upset because I'm too close to him? She steepled her fingers under her chin, undisturbed by my outburst. On the scale of emotional incidents around here, we might as well be having a sedate tea. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. I'll authorize you to continue your sessions for the time being, but I'll be monitoring your work closely. And please know, Maya, she stopped me as I headed for the door. I believe in you. Belief is a powerful thing. It grabs you, unmakes you, changes the tilt and angle of everything around you into entirely different geometry. You see the world in a new shape, and no matter how horrible the belief, no matter what awful things it makes you do, a part of you is still grateful for the structure. I'd believed a lot of things in my life, most of them about my mother. I'd believed in Santa Claus until I found the frosted animal crackers I only got once a year in my stocking, tucked away in Mom's sock drawer. They were brittle cookies, animal shapes coated with a careless icing, like snow drifted into patches along back alleys, and the ones I found were leftovers, crumbled into the tiny rocks at the bottom of the bag. She cried when I brought them out, perplexed by my discovery, and after she broke down, I immediately wanted to hide the bag, to bury it at the bottom of a snowbank that would never melt. I believed our rock garden would make her happy, and that if I could memorize just one more mineral, her eyes would blink into focus again, and she would hug me with pride. Later, when she left us, I believed every word of her goodbye letter. Everything shifted into place. The job she could never keep, the long silences when Dad was gone, how her sadness swamped her at the strangest times, in the grocery store or walking me to school. I'd look up and her face would be wet, eyes averted and unwiped. If I tried to hug her, it seemed to make her worse. If I ignored it, the gap between us only widened. She hadn't wanted me, hadn't wanted this life, and disappeared like the Bannock burn before I could demand a reason why, to ask what I'd done that was so intolerable. Sometimes I even wondered if I'd studied speech so I could dissect my memories of her. I played odd videos of us over and over, but could never find any hint of her intentions. I hated the counselors who pulled me into their offices, the words that came so easily to them and had been impossible for her. The thing no one understands when your parent abandons you is that it doesn't happen just once. They leave every day. Every moment that you remember them is a door slamming shut in your face. And with every slam, you believe a little more each time that you probably deserved it. My belief about Lucas Blackthorne was nothing like that creeping kind of blame. It didn't gradually take root in my consciousness over years. I woke up this morning with a certainty flowing through me that not even Dr. Mita could derail. I hated myself for lying to her. Sane Dr. Mita, sober Dr. Mita, a woman who had faith in the faithless and confidence in the worst people you could imagine. After all, she'd hired me. She'd challenged me, elevated me, believed in me, but now I wondered how much she really understood me. If she did, she never would have given me the assignment. Before I met Lucas, I don't think I'd even understood myself. This is what I know now. A father had disappeared. A son was desperate to find him, and I would tell 1,000 lies if it brought him one step closer. The path before me seemed so clear, and it gave meaning to everything I'd survived to get to this point. I had to help Lucas find his father. No matter what Josiah had done, no matter what had driven them into the Boundary Waters, they needed to find each other, and I was possibly the only person in the world who understood how much. But the clock was ticking. Every day the winds blew harder and colder, the gales raged in a losing battle against the coming winter. Soon the ice would win. Soon Josiah might be dead, and we'd be out of time. I gathered up my session supplies and jogged up the stairs to Ward 2. I could feel the organs in my body pumping, expanding, the excitement we set loose in every nerve ending, flashing with a life I hadn't known was inside me. Without any premonition of what lay ahead, I badged into Ward 2 and caught a flash of Lucas's face before the world jerked sideways. Chapter 13. A crushing weight knocked me to the ground, sending the air whooshing out of my lungs. Several people yelled my name, the loudest one right in my ear. "Tag, Maya! Tag, Maya!" the voice shouted gleefully. I twisted around and pulled his skull into a headlock as Lucas appeared above us, grabbing a massive arm and ripping it backward. Big George shrieked in pain. "Back off, Lucas, now!" I managed to order as 2 nurses came to pry our tag player off me. After we got untangled and de-escalated the situation, the other staff and I led Big George to his favorite squishy chair and sat him down. He held his arm and rocked, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. I nodded to the nurses and they gave us a little distance, returning to the bustle of the adult men's common room. Most of the other patients watched us to see how the show would turn out. But when nothing more exciting happened than Big George sniffling into the crook of his arm, they gradually resumed their card games, books, and TV programs. Faces turned away from the window of the classroom, where one of the life skills coaches held up a rainbow-colored chart. Lucas paced behind the row of sofas in front of the TV, and even though he didn't look over once, I knew I had his undivided attention. Big George was holding his throat now, and he'd gotten himself into a loop, repeating "ow" over and over. "What hurts, George? Tell me." Instead of verbalizing, he pointed to his arm and neck, and then, as he always did when something ached, he doubled over and pressed his palms against his head. Big George had lived at Congdon for 20 years, ever since he and 2 friends robbed a grocery store at gunpoint in Cloette, loaded up trash bags with cash and food, and met a squad car on their way out. The other 2 began shooting at the police and were killed on sight, but George was lucky. He'd been hunched over a box of Triscuits when they opened fire, and the angle of the bullet through his head missed every major artery. He had the aptitude of a 4-year-old now, ate every meal as if his life depended on it, and was aggressively cheery unless he felt the slightest twinge of pain, reminding him a phantom bullet lived in his head, or if he saw anything resembling a tan, plaid square, which would send him spiraling into a meltdown. Triscuits were strictly banned in the men's ward. I gave him a second to work through his feelings, and then doubled over my own legs, mirroring his pose. When I got his attention, I pointed to the ankle Bryce's taser had sprained. "I've got a place that hurts too." As George reached out to tap my shin, I asked him, "Where am I hurt?" "Leg." "This is my leg." I sounded as excited as anyone could about discovering a piece of their body, and he caught on to my enthusiasm, pointing to his head. This is my Al. Keeping my grin in place with a Herculean effort, I corrected him. No, silly, that's your head. He cackled and we kept going. The body part naming game, an old favorite, and a comfortable way for him to articulate complete sentences. I'd tuck a bunch of fabric samples in the surprise bag with another exercise in mind, but swatches could wait. We played while tears dried on the dark mounds of his cheeks, until I pushed him beyond all the body parts he knew and into the more phonetically uncomfortable territory of forearm and spine, where cognitive fatigue soon settled in. Sessions with George were always brief. To end, I pulled him to his feet and we sang a version of Dem Bones, hopping around the common room. Toe bone connected to the foot bone connected to the heel bone. George loved singing and was oblivious to the snickers and stares. We spun and danced while recapping all the body parts he might need to verbalize to his doctors in the event of illness or injury. After we finished, the easy grin melted into a more complicated emotion, and his next words came out in a quiet but perfectly clear cadence. Sorry, sorry, sorry. What are you sorry for, George? Tag, Maya, I'm sorry. Thank you for finding those words. I touched his arm and grinned into his contrite face. Next time you play tag, you've got to remember you're a big old bear. You can't go around tagging little gnats like me. Bird. He petted my hair and cracked a smile. Maya's a bird. Bears have to be careful of birds, okay? Okay, Maya. I left Big George in the care of one of the nurses and wandered through the ward with his words repeating in my head. This is my Al. When I was first promoted to speech therapist, I focused on one thing, helping my patients speak. I spent all my sessions working on palate exercises, pronunciation, articulation, and sound. The goal was form. Whatever coherent subject matter they produced had ended up on their doctor's plate, not mine. But now Lucas was changing everything. I couldn't ignore the meaning behind the words. Couldn't keep describing the water in the boat without wanting to plug the holes. This is my Al. My heart ached for Big George, for the broke, hungry kid who would probably grow old inside these walls. He had no support network outside of Congdon, nowhere to go if he was ever released, and no hope of becoming self-sufficient. All I could do was point to my forearm, teach him words he would forget by our next session, and try to make him smile. I poked my head into every room along the corridor, trying to locate the one person in this building who'd actually asked for my help and who had suddenly, if characteristically, vanished. Finally, I found him at the far end of the dining room, and what he was doing stopped me in my tracks. He ran full speed at the wall, and then, without slowing down, ran up the side of it, turned sideways, and landed lightly back on his feet, jogging to where he began. That sling he still wore on one arm didn't slow him down at all. Or maybe it did. Maybe if he hadn't been wearing it, he could have scaled farther, gone higher. I had a vision of the fence outside, of Lucas clearing the entire thing in one giant leap. I might have George's bird. I might have been George's bird, but Lucas was the one who was trying to fly. I watched him repeat the trick 2 more times with my mouth hanging open before realizing I wasn't his only audience. The Grinch sat at a table nearby, puffing on an e-cigarette with a light head twitch as Lucas went almost horizontal against the cement blocks. I think I'm having an episode. He puffed, eyes straight ahead and unblinking. Me too. He grunted in acknowledgement. The Grinch was another lifer, but for far different reasons than Big George. His schizophrenia was well managed with medication, and he'd conquered most of his paranoia, even completing some vocational training he would never have the opportunity to use. He had been found not guilty by reason of insanity for hacking up the young couple and their 2-year-old twins who lived next door to him. But guilt didn't matter with some crimes. There would never be any protesters at the gates for the Grinch, demanding his release. People might understand rationally that his illness had caused the crime, but they would keep the man locked up long after the illness had been treated. After a decade of perfect behavior, the only concession the system had granted him was a transfer from the state security hospital, where most of Minnesota's criminally insane residents lived, to the relatively progressive environment of Congdon. He would die in the high security ward here, a Scrabble champion who would never feel the breeze of an OE on his upturned face. My story was the exception, and I always assumed the basis of Dr. Mita's affection for me. Most of her beds were taken by forensic patients, and the longer ones, like Big George and the Grinch, stayed, the fewer voluntary patients she could accommodate. Rather than treat patients when they actually sought help, she had to wait until their mental illness caused them to commit a crime, and then hope the courts would send them to convent instead of prison. I was lucky. I'd been in and out in under 6 months, barely a blink of Big George's eye, and now I had to help Lucas get even luckier. Finishing his show and not even out of breath, Lucas walked over to the tables. He leaned down to murmur something in the Grinch's ear, then clapped him on the shoulder, and walked past me without a word or glance. I was still so stunned that it wasn't until he left the dining room I realized he was blowing me off. Pivoting out into the hallway, I raised my voice. "We have a session, Mr. Blackthorne." He turned around at the other end of the corridor. "You told me to back off. That was then, this is now. Keep up with the schedule, will you? So you're done being tackled by huge men?" Even across this distance, his irritation was powerful. I tried not to laugh. "In the grand scheme of things, let's hope not. But today," I shrugged and went back to the dining room, pulling out papers from the surprise bag and laying them in rough geographic order on the nearest table. The Grinch paced the wall where Lucas had been running, muttering to himself in a monotone and taking drags of his e-cigarette. I kept working even after I sensed Lucas standing behind me. Once everything was arranged, I started marking places with a pen, narrating in a voice been just to, that could have easily been just to keep myself company. "Here's where you are found." I pointed to the blue X and talked through the paths that grew like tree branches through the paddle and portage routes, beginning in L, stopping when I hit the 15-mile range and the jagged edge of the international border. I lingered on the line, drawn like a stuttering heart monitor, and finally turned my head to acknowledging Lucas's presence. "I need to know where you left him. Everything you can remember, if we're going to be able to locate him in time." Lucas took a step forward, swallowing as his eyes filled with tightly banked emotions. "You're going to help me?" Swiveling back to the table, I shifted one of the copies a millimeter to the right. "Nothing gets by you, huh?" When I started to tape the fragments of the maps together, he moved up beside me and held the edges together with his one good arm, helping me create a patchwork whole. "Thank you." "Don't thank me until you've heard the plan." I lifted my face to his and smiled. "Let's get to work." 30 minutes later, after discussing, debating, and flat out arguing in whispers too low for anyone else to overhear, I gathered up all the papers and stuffed them away. Lucas wanted to leave for the Boundary Waters yesterday and refused to even try to understand how the system worked. He thought my way was irritating and pointless, which made me think it was the most adult plan I'd ever had. I slung the surprise bag over my shoulder, ready to beat hell across the building for my next session, an OCD patient who would take it badly if I wasn't punctual. Lucas stood up with me. "Can I ask you another question?" I glanced at the clock again. I had 3 minutes. "Only if it can be answered in 5 words or less." His mouth quirked up, the first sign of humor I'd seen from him all day. "That's up to you." He walked me to the cafeteria door and pushed it open with his good arm, easily keeping up with my determined pace. "What did you mean earlier by the grand scheme of things?" It took me a second to remember what he was talking about, and then it flashed back. The quip about being tackled by large men. I felt my cheeks getting warm as we headed toward the rear exit of the ward. Sometimes, I paused before counting the words on my fingers, tackling can be fun. We reached the end of the hall and I reached for my ID. "You're talking about sex?" Badge in hand, I ran out of reasons to avoid his gaze. We stared at each other for a second. Then I smiled and activated the door. "That's 2 questions." All right, so we're going to stop there. And as usual, like and comment, and I will respond to your comments. If you want me to read a specific book or a specific genre, let me know in the comments and I will add them to the rotation. See you next time.